organizations in this country. And it's the same thing with unpredictability. If businesses are saying, I need to change your schedule, there are costs to workers, and it's a way to share that cost, just like the overtime premium is a way to share, the cost of saying we need you to work more than 40 hours a week. And so that's how I think of it. It is, I think you would find, in the literature, you can see the same kind of arguments at the time of the Fair Labor Standards Act, that they didn't want to, pay for overtime, and, or get rid of child labor. And so that is not to diminish these concerns. I do want to say, I think one of the positive things happening here in Minnesota that is that businesses right now, before the ordinance gets put into place, are coming out and voicing their concerns. That's a very positive thing, so that to figure out what works for whom, which parts of the ordinance might affect everyone, what ones might need to be, slowly added on, and only if employers, not just the ones who have drank the Kool-Aid on this, but the other ones who really have serious concerns about it are engaged in that dialogue, is the ordinance going to work for everyone. So, I see that as a positive thing here. So I think that, the reason the predictability pay there is because that is the new normal for workers. That 40 hours a week with no changes, 74% of Americans say that they work different hours one week and another week in the same month. And most of that is driven by the needs of their employer, not because they're choosing to work longer. And so it is a widespread, issue, and business should help share the cost.
Thank you. I think we just have one or two more questions. Councilmember Palmisano.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dr. Lambert, I appreciate that you can't share all the businesses that you've done work with and everything, but can you give us a sense of approximately how large they are, like how many employees they have? Because it's helpful to know that, to be able to map some of your research into these other industries and these other businesses in our community.
Sure, and I'll be glad to provide, articles and, papers and things if anybody's interested in them as well. So mostly what I have studied are large employers. I have studied family-owned and publicly held large employers, but mostly employers that have at least 500 workers, even if they're spread around. Now, one of the randomized study where all those graphs came from at this moment, that's a national women's apparel retailer, and the stores are located in strip malls. And so the average size of staff in those stores are 10 workers. They have some stores that are as big as having 17. But we wanted to do that because, we only had to get into one firm to do an experiment, but also so that we could, randomly assign, there's several in a city, but also in order to see, can you do this with a small staff? And I think one of the things that we found in the course of the study is that, boy, those store managers know their workers much better than in larger firms. And they know what kind of works for them and what doesn't. And so in some ways, my sense is that, kind of a smaller kind of business is kind of advantaged in that way in terms of helping create schedules that work for workers. But where they are disadvantaged, if the national retail firm was not, behind this study, those managers would not have those forecasts of predictions of, how many hours to use what week. Those came from their corporate offices. Those came from very sophisticated people who run regression equations, who literally put in everything like, what's the probability that it's going to snow this week? And, what's the probability of, that if you're in a city that the team will be in the playoffs? And I have to say, I keep laughing to myself thinking if the Cubs get in tomorrow to the playoffs, which they might if they win one more game. It's going to throw off everybody's predictions. But they put in all of these things. And again, we can see that they're very accurate, and that's what the scheduling vendors tell us. So it's that part of it, that the small businesses, I think, really don't have. And you can be a very good manager and, over time kind of know the flow of your work, but that's different than having tools that help you see that, stability and predictability, and maybe also help drive business in. When you can see the downsides, what can you do to help fill it in?
Thank you.
Thank you. I had a question. So, and this has been really helpful. I just want to say again, thank you for the research and sharing what you have done and what maybe are areas for the future. I think, as you've been indicating, that the most dialogue that I've been having where employers are saying, and some say they, philosophically don't agree with this, but some employers are saying, well, I understand the concept, but I am a smaller independent business. I not only may not have access to the types of tools that a larger enterprise has, but I also have a smaller margin. And so I think a couple of good examples where we're hearing those kinds of questions and concerns and just, I want you to understand my business kind of thing is from food industry, particularly the restaurant industry. And I think we have a very vibrant, independent restaurant industry here. And other place would be smaller businesses that describe their business as somewhat dependent on the weather. So, and I think some of the restaurant industry describes their business that way too. But so I was curious what thoughts you had in response to that, and because I think that's something where we have heard a lot of those comments, and they are concerning. So,
and they, and I do not want to say that they are wrong at all, right? Those are real concerns. So. I guess one of the reactions that I have to that, or one of the thoughts that I have, there's kind of two thoughts. One is that I think, in Minneapolis, and what you could also help do for the rest of the nation, is to maybe identify what are really some basic employment standards that everyone should have a right to have. I mean, it's posting schedules 2 weeks in advance, for example. Limiting, changes to it. I mean, there are probably, you and many people, I think now in the U.S. are trying to figure out what kinds of basic labor standards do we need for a 21st century economy? Because the Fair Labor Standards Act, we still need those protections, but there's a lot of other things that have come up that place workers and families in economic peril. Another way to think about this is there needs to be a package, but perhaps in some industries and perhaps for smaller businesses, and not necessarily small businesses in terms of 10 people, but in smaller revenue businesses where they might not have the capacity to, get new tools. There's technical assistance. But also, one of the things that we have suggested in the past is that maybe businesses start with a menu. Okay, I can't completely get rid of variations, but I can guarantee my workers 20 hours a week. I can't tell them, exactly what days those are going to be, but I will guarantee them a minimum number of hours. Other ones, that might not work for their kind of business, and they can say, I can't guarantee that, but I can say that you are going to only work afternoons so that you can have another job at night. You're going to work these kinds of schedules, and that allows you to know and have some kind of predictability so you can take classes so that you can get another job. And so if you think about kind of the different components of this, there's adequacy, stability, predictability, and input. That small businesses, I'll bet you, can do something on some of those. Maybe not all of them together, but I bet they can do better on some of those components, and that it would make a real difference to their workers.
Councilmember Fry.
Thank you, Madam Vice President, and thank you, Ms. Lambert, for your presentation. First, you had mentioned that the vast majority of the statistics that we've been looking at were for very large corporations and privately held businesses above 500 employees. What percentage of them were smaller and local businesses, say, below 10?
So of the data that had like the graphs and stuff, right, those are all large businesses.
So zero of them were below 500?
Right.
Okay.
But the national data on our workforce, those have workers from every size employer, and we have not broken. We're in the middle of writing a piece off of those data, so I haven't broken it down yet by the size of employer, but we'll be able to do that.
And then what percentage of the stats that we're seeing were restaurants or the service industry generally?
None of them are restaurants. The data on, except for the national data where you can see the food service workers, where it's broken out by those occupations, that has food, restaurant workers in there. So all of the case examples that I have right here come from retail. Now I have studied manufacturing firms, I've studied banks, I've studied airport, airlines. I have studied hospitality, hotels with restaurants in them, but not independent standing. Anna Haley Locke at the University of Wisconsin-Madison has studied scheduling practices in restaurants, and you might want to contact her. I mean, basically across all these industries, managers use some kind of metric to look at how much labor they're using in proportion to demand. I mean, it's just, who wouldn't?
Yep,
the question is how they use it.
You also mentioned that certain practices may not work for specific employers, but others may work. I mean, you mentioned, well, maybe they can't give predictability, as much predictability as would be desired in terms of schedule, but perhaps they can give a guaranteed number of hours per week. How would you recommend that we legislate based on differences between individual employers in terms of what they can handle and what they can't, in terms of the industry, in terms of business size and practice?
I think that's a reason that one of the first things to think about are what are basic employment protections. What should every worker have a right to in the United States when they work? And then think about how we might, kind of deliver that to workers. Regardless, I mean, somebody's need for childcare does not depend upon whether they work for a big business or a small business. Their need to be able to have a steady income does not depend on the size of the business they work in. So I think what's important is to engage, with business about how to deliver those basic standards to workers.
No, so I fully understand your points, but my question is, you mentioned that we could maybe have different standards for different industries and employers. My question is, how do we legislate or enforce based on those different standards? You
are the city council. I am an academic, so I'm not going to make any kind of suggestion like that. I'm just offering that as a suggestion that, I think overall what we all want to do is create an environment where workers have more stable, predictable, adequate hours, and we don't harm employers. We want employers to be profitable. We want to have a strong economy. So I think
the question wasn't a rhetorical one. I was honestly asking if there was a recommendation for how to legislate.
I'm an academic. I'm not going to tell you how to do your legislation.
Okay. And then has the issue of, not from the employer side, but from the employee side, about the divergence between scheduling and then flexibility come across your table at all? And then how that would be interwoven with predictability pay?
Right. So it could be that depending on how certain provisions are worded and implemented, I mean, it could be that managers will be, reluctant to grant workers' requests for time off. But that's why it needs to be a package with the right to request legislation. Workers should have the right to request, accommodations and not be retaliated against it. And that's why it kind of needs to all fit together. What we see in our research is that predictability is very different than flexibility. Flexibility is when you have input into your work schedule. You can have input into your work schedule and still have predictability. Overall, you can have your schedule 2 weeks in advance. For example, we look at predictability in terms of advance notice, but you've also had input into it. You've put in your request for time off. Something comes up, you can take your sick day.
So have you seen, are there instances in other cities where employers are denying a change? Let me take a step back. Are there instances in other cities where an employer is denying an employee to deviate from the schedule based on their concern that they would then need to fill that shift with a new employee and thus pay predictability pay?
I have not studied that, so I don't want to, I don't want to say anything that I don't have.
No, and I appreciate that. Yeah.
Right. So I would think that people on the ground, maybe some of the advocates or, employers might, have more information for you on
Thank you. That would be, that's helpful. And then you mentioned retaliation just a minute ago. Mm-hmm. Obviously, that's a significant concern as well as an issue resulting from a submittal of a complaint. Do you have any information on the percentage of cases that are experience retaliation following, or at least alleged retaliation following the submittal?
No, what we do see, though, is that when workers put any kind of, I wouldn't call this retaliation, so I just want to go on the books that this is not exactly retaliation. It's not retaliation. But when workers put any constraints on their availability, for example, in the retail settings, I want to be clear that it's about that, that they get scheduled for fewer hours than their more available counterparts. So they're paying for that flexibility. And part of the reason for that is that there aren't guaranteed minimum hours.
So I'm sorry to interrupt you. So are you saying that following a complaint, another employee gets less hours, or you're just saying generally speaking?
Just generally speaking.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
Thank you. That was very helpful.
Okay.
Thank you. And that is perfectly timed, Councilmember Fry. As I promised, we would just end at noon, and I think we are just on the dot of noon. So I want to thank my colleagues for participating in the study session. I want to thank our staff and our guests, Assistant Commissioner Ayers, and of course, Dr. Lambert, for being here and engaging with us. Thank you very much. Study session is done.